Did you know that before the attack on Pearl Harbor, there were already Filipino Americans fighting with the U.S. in World War II? In this episode of the Filipino American War Stories Project, we look at the experiences of two Filipino American veterans from Hawaii who fought in the Pacific Theater during the early years of the war. This is part 6 of our special series on Filipino American veterans of the Pacific War. And today's stories come to us from two veterans. The first is Pacific Missile Man Felix C. Castro, whose story was published in the Honolulu Star Bulletin in 1945. Our second veteran is Bataan Campaign survivor and POW Private First Class Severo Quintero. His story was recorded by the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress in 2005. By 1939, thousands of Filipinos had immigrated to the Hawaiian Islands. Many of them were students attending the University of Hawaii, while others worked as agricultural laborers or in various businesses. When war broke out between Japan and the United States, many Filipino Americans immediately enlisted in the military, eager to defend the islands they called home. At the time, however, the U.S. military did not accept Filipinos into any of its branches. It would be several months before the attack on Pearl Harbor finally opened the door for them. On December 7, 1941, Felix Castro was stationed as a member of the 24th Pursuit Squadron, Philippine Army Air Corps at Clark Field when Japanese bombers descended upon the airfield. The attack caught the Filipino and American airmen completely off guard. In his Star Bulletin article, Castro recalled how he and his fellow airmen scrambled to get their planes airborne. "I looked over towards the beach and saw a large fleet of Japanese bombers and fighters diving toward the target. That was my first indication that we were actually at war." After the Philippines declared war on Japan on December 8, the Philippine Army Air Corps absorbed the much smaller Hawaiian Department of National Defense organized by Filipino volunteers in Hawaii prior to Pearl Harbor. This made Castro one of the few Filipino American soldiers to fight in the defense of the Philippines. However, after Japan occupied the Philippines, most Filipino Americans were evacuated to the mainland United States due to security concerns. Castro, along with other Filipino airmen who had studied in the United States, were allowed to remain in uniform and continue fighting against the Japanese. He would eventually serve as a fighter pilot flying P-40s and P-61s. He also flew transport missions in India and China. After the war, Castro would return to the Philippines where he married his childhood sweetheart. He later returned to the United States and settled in Hawaii where he worked for Pan Am as a pilot. Meanwhile, back in the Philippines, Private First Class Severo Quintero was fighting in the Bataan Campaign. On December 8, 1941, after the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Manuel Quezon ordered the Philippine Army to defend the country. At the time, only 350 poorly trained and equipped Filipino soldiers were available for combat. This was not enough to stop the well-trained and well-equipped Japanese forces. By January 9, 1942, Filipino and American troops had retreated to the Bataan Peninsula. Here, under the command of General Edward King, they continued to put up a valiant defense against the Japanese. However, on April 9, 1942, after running out of food, ammunition, and almost all hope, they surrendered to the Japanese. As a prisoner of war, Quintero endured forced marches, torture, and starvation. He and his fellow Filipino soldiers became known as the Death March because of the high number of casualties along the way. Of the 75,000 Filipino soldiers taken prisoner, only about 10,000 survived the ordeal. One of those who did not survive was Bataan Campaign veteran and former Hawaiian resident Antonio Luna. While on the infamous Bataan Death March, Luna fell ill and died. His remains are still missing. Luna was awarded the Purple Heart and the Philippine Presidential Unit Citation for his sacrifice. Castro, on the other hand, was able to escape Japanese captivity when Manila fell. He and his comrades were able to secure passage on a ship bound for Australia. Upon arrival, he was given the option to join the Australian Imperial Forces, the British Army, or the American Volunteer Group. He chose the latter. From there, Castro underwent training in Australia and then went to India. Like many Filipino Americans who served in the Pacific Theater, both Castro and Quintero had to prove themselves not only to their fellow American soldiers but also to the Filipino community. Back in Hawaii, Castro was initially met with skepticism from some of his peers who believed that the United States would not win the war. Despite this, he and other Filipino Americans who served in the war were eventually accepted and celebrated as heroes. When the United States officially entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the armed services were quickly mobilized to defend the Hawaiian Islands. This meant that many Filipino Americans found themselves being pulled into a conflict that they had no choice but to fight in. Prior to Pearl Harbor, the U.S. military did not allow Filipinos to become naturalized citizens, even though many had been living in the United States for decades. But the attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. It opened the floodgates for many Filipinos to enlist and serve in the U.S. military. Thousands of Filipinos rushed to join the armed forces, eager to defend the islands that they had come to call home. But it wasn't easy. They faced discrimination and prejudice every step of the way. Many of them were turned away at recruitment offices because of their race. But they didn't give up. They pushed on, determined to prove themselves and serve their country. Some of them were eventually accepted and became members of the 100th Infantry Battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and other units. These Filipino Americans fought bravely in some of the most intense battles of the war. They faced machine gun fire, mortars, and artillery attacks head-on. And despite the danger, they never backed down. Even though Filipino Americans were fighting for the United States, they often did so without the full support of the government. They were not given the same access to resources and training as other soldiers. But they didn't complain. They made do with what they had and fought with honor and courage. Their bravery was evident in every battle they fought in. They were willing to put their lives on the line to defend the United States, and they did so without hesitation. Despite the challenges they faced, these Filipino Americans emerged as heroes. They were awarded medals and commendations for their bravery and service. They were recognized for their contributions to the war effort and celebrated for their courage. Their legacy continues to inspire people today. They serve as a reminder that no matter what challenges we face, we can overcome them if we have the courage and determination to do so. Today, we remember the Filipino American soldiers who fought in World War II and their contributions to the war effort. We honor their bravery, their sacrifice, and their dedication to the United States. They may have faced discrimination and prejudice, but they never gave up. They fought for freedom and democracy, and they won. Their story is an important part of American history, and we should never forget it. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and share it with your friends. Subscribe to the channel and follow us on social media. Your support helps us continue producing quality content that honors the sacrifices of our veterans. If you have a veteran in your family, please consider sharing their story with us. You can use the submission link in the description below to submit your veteran story. Thank you for watching. See you next time. More than 250,000 Filipino men fought alongside the United States during World War II, both under U.S. command and as guerrillas behind enemy lines. They fought in every major theater of war, from the jungles of the Philippine Islands to the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. Filipino Americans were an integral part of the American war machine, and yet they remain largely unknown to most Americans today. Their story is one worth telling. And I'm gonna tell it right after this. The Philippines was a U.S. territory at the outbreak of the Second World War. The United States had acquired the Philippines through the Treaty of Paris in 1898 at the conclusion of the Spanish-American War. As a result, when the Japanese began their military campaign in the Pacific in 1941, the islands were subject to Japanese attack. Indeed, within 2 months of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Imperial Army had taken control over most of the Philippine Islands. The Philippine President Manuel Quezon immediately requested that the U.S. Army liberate his country. And many Filipino Americans echoed this call. In fact, Filipino Americans across the U.S. actively campaigned to join the U.S. military and fight for the liberation of their homeland. It wasn't easy. Filipino Americans were turned away from recruitment offices because of quotas and because of prejudice against Asians. But as the war dragged on and the manpower pool in the U.S. shrank, the U.S. military eventually opened its doors to Filipino Americans. The first unit to be formed was the 1st Filipino Infantry Regiment, also known as the Moro Tapu or the Monkey Soldiers by the Japanese. It was a segregated U.S. Army regiment composed of Filipino Americans. Nearly 1,500 men volunteered for the unit and underwent training at Camp Tuamal in Mississippi. The group was officially organized into a regiment on October 11, 1942. Colonel Charles B. King, a career Army officer, became the commanding officer of the 1st Filipino Infantry. Also serving in the unit was Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Farron Edwards, who would later become famous as the commanding officer of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. After completing their training, the regiment shipped out for New Guinea where they saw their first combat. The 1st Filipino Infantry Regiment fought alongside Australian forces against the Japanese. They distinguished themselves in several battles, including the Battle of Bunagona in December 1942. This was a costly 8-week campaign in which the Japanese suffered heavy casualties and the Allies recaptured vital territory from the Japanese. The Filipino infantrymen's courage and tenacity in battle were evident as they fought in some of the most difficult terrain and conditions. In one instance, they took heavy casualties but refused to retreat. Another time, despite being outnumbered, they launched a surprise attack that caught the Japanese off guard and resulted in significant losses for the enemy. Their bravery and skill in combat earned them the respect of not only the Allies but also the Japanese, who recognized them as formidable opponents. After the battle, the 1st Filipino Infantry Regiment continued to fight in other campaigns in New Guinea. However, it was during these battles that racial tensions began to emerge within the unit. The Filipino soldiers faced discrimination and prejudice from some of their white American counterparts. Despite these challenges, they continued to perform bravely and effectively in combat. The 1st Filipino Infantry Regiment's service in New Guinea demonstrated their valor and sacrifice in World War II. Their contributions to the war effort were instrumental in helping the Allies gain the upper hand against the Japanese in the Pacific. By late 1944, the U.S. military had developed a plan to retake the Philippine Islands from the Japanese. On October 20, 1944, the U.S. landed troops in the island of Light in what would become known as the Light Campaign. Many Filipino Americans in the 1st Filipino Infantry Regiment were eager to return home and fight for the liberation of their homeland. They were excited to have the opportunity to defend their ancestral land and contribute to the war effort in a more direct way. Additionally, they were motivated by a sense of duty and loyalty to the Philippines and its people. For many of these soldiers, fighting for the Philippines was a chance to demonstrate their patriotism and loyalty to the country they considered home. Unfortunately, upon arrival, they learned that guerrilla forces were already waging a war against the Japanese occupation forces. These Filipino guerrillas were led by local commanders who had organized resistance groups to fight back against the Japanese. When the soldiers learned about the guerrilla forces, they were inspired by their bravery and determination. They realized that they were joining a larger movement to liberate the Philippines from Japanese control. Instead of simply following orders from their American superiors, many Filipino American soldiers in the 1st Filipino Infantry Regiment wanted to work alongside the Filipino guerrillas and learn from their experiences. They saw the guerrillas as valuable assets in the war effort and believed that by working together, they could achieve greater success against the Japanese. Despite these sentiments, their American commanders did not view the guerrillas favorably. Many American commanders viewed the guerrillas with suspicion, believing that they were disorganized, undisciplined, and potentially a threat to the U.S. military operations. Some commanders were concerned that the guerrillas might engage in activities that could jeopardize the safety of U.S. troops or hinder their ability to carry out their missions. Additionally, there were logistical challenges associated with working with the guerrillas. The U.S. military had established supply lines and communication networks that were designed to support their own troops. Integrating the guerrillas into these systems was not easy and often led to confusion and miscommunication. Moreover, there were cultural and linguistic barriers between the U.S. soldiers and the Filipino guerrillas. While many Filipino Americans in the 1st Filipino Infantry Regiment spoke English, the guerrillas primarily spoke Filipino languages such as Tagalog or Cebuano. This language barrier made it difficult to communicate effectively and coordinate actions. Despite these challenges, many Filipino American soldiers in the 1st Filipino Infantry Regiment continued to advocate for working with the Filipino guerrillas. They argued that the guerrillas had valuable knowledge of the terrain and the enemy, and that their support could be crucial in achieving victory. However, their efforts to work with the guerrillas were often met with resistance from their American superiors. Eventually, the 1st Filipino Infantry Regiment was ordered to withdraw from the Philippines and continue fighting against the Japanese in other theaters of war. They went on to participate in other notable campaigns such as the liberation of Borneo. Meanwhile, the Filipino guerrillas continued to fight alongside American and other allied forces to liberate the Philippines from Japanese occupation. Although the Filipino Americans in the 1st Filipino Infantry Regiment were unable to fight alongside the Filipino guerrillas in the Philippines, their contributions to the war effort should not be overlooked. They fought bravely against the Japanese in other theaters of war and helped to secure victories that ultimately led to the liberation of the Philippines. But let me tell you, Filipino Americans didn't just fight in the Pacific. They were also present in Europe, where they served in all Asian infantry units. They fought in the hard-fought campaigns across Italy and France and risked their lives in the infamous Battle of the Bulge. But their presence in these theaters of war was often overlooked, and their stories remain hidden. There were also Filipino Scouts who served in the U.S. Armed Forces in the Pacific. These individuals were employed by the U.S. military for their knowledge of the terrain and their ability to speak Japanese. One of the most famous groups of Filipino Scouts was the 66th Infantry, also known as the Philippine Scouts. They fought in several major battles in the Pacific, including the Battle of Midway and the Battle of Iwo Jima. Their service in these battles was instrumental in helping the Allies gain the upper hand against the Japanese in the Pacific. Another group of Filipino Scouts were employed by the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA. These scouts carried out espionage and sabotage missions behind enemy lines in the Philippines and other parts of Asia. Their work was crucial in providing the Allies with intelligence on Japanese military activities and gathering information that helped to undermine Japanese efforts in the region. These are just a few examples of the many ways that Filipino Americans served in the U.S. military during World War II. Their service was instrumental in helping the Allies win the war and secure victory in every theater of war. And yet their contributions are often overlooked and their stories remain hidden. It's important to remember and acknowledge their service and sacrifice, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because their stories can help to inspire future generations of Americans and remind us of the importance of diversity and inclusion in our armed forces. So if you want to learn more about the Filipino American soldiers who fought in World War II, check out the links below. Thank you for listening. This has been your host. Until next time, remember John. They fought shoulder to shoulder with U.S. soldiers in some of the largest battles of World War II. But when it came time to claim the benefits they were promised for their service, many Filipino veterans were told they weren't actually soldiers. They were civilians. They were laborers. They were a bunch of undesirables. This is a story about one group of World War II heroes and the long fight to get the recognition and benefits they deserve. It's me. This is a World War II special episode about Filipino veterans. And here's one of the most famous pictures from the war. It shows starving, wounded and exhausted Filipino soldiers marching alongside U.S. troops during the Bataan Death March. The Japanese had just captured the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines and were forcing 75,000 Filipino and American troops to walk behind them on a 65-mile march. Many prisoners died from exhaustion, starvation, disease, and executions. And those who survived the march then had to survive the infamous Japanese prison camps. But why were there Filipino soldiers fighting alongside Americans in the first place? Well, the Philippines used to be a Spanish colony, but in 1898, the Spanish lost control, and the United States took over. The new government was made up of both Americans and Filipinos, but many Filipinos felt that the U.S. was just another form of colonial rule. And so there was a lot of opposition to American control, which peaked in 1902 with the Philippine Revolution. By this point, though, the revolutionaries were heavily outnumbered and outgunned. And instead of fighting a losing battle against the U.S. military, the Filipino leader Emilio Aguinaldo decided to make a deal with the U.S. government. It established a system where Filipinos could serve in the U.S. military, specifically in a unit called the Philippine Scouts. They served in Korea, China, the Pacific, and in World War II. More than 150,000 Filipinos would end up serving in the armed forces of the United States. They were treated as second-class citizens, though with lower pay, fewer rights, and separate living quarters. They were still far better off than if they were fighting for independence. At least they got training and equipment and maybe even some camaraderie. So when the Japanese attacked the Philippines at the start of World War II, these soldiers were ready to defend the islands. The Philippine Scouts fought bravely, especially against Japan, because the Japanese invasion threatened the independence of the Philippines. President Manuel Quezon asked Congress to allow the Scouts to become full U.S. Army soldiers, but they refused. Quezon then appealed to the people directly, saying, "We have no choice but to resist the Japanese invaders. We must join our American friends in fighting side by side for our common safety." And fortunately, Quezon was right. The Japanese army proved to be way too strong. And after 3 months of fighting, the Philippine Scouts along with thousands of Filipino reservists and volunteers were captured. But not all Filipino men were in the Philippine Scouts or the reserve units. Some were working as clerks, farmers, or shopkeepers. These men had never held a gun before, much less been in combat. But when the Japanese took over the islands, they needed weapons. They took any weapons they could find. And so a band of Filipino guerrillas formed. One of the most famous groups was the Hukbalahap, also known as the Huks. Their name isn't really appropriate for YouTube, but it means people who sacrifice their lives for others. The Huks didn't just attack the Japanese, they also fought against people who collaborated with the enemy. They targeted landlords who raised rents and prices. They cut communication lines, blew up bridges, assassinated collaborators, and even attacked Japanese supply convoys. They were effective too. One report estimated that the Huks killed almost 3,000 Japanese soldiers during the war. So what do we remember the Filipino veterans for? For one, their bravery. They fought in some of the biggest battles of the war, including the liberation of the Philippines, the Battle of Leyte, and the Battle of Manila. The Filipino veterans also played an important role in providing intelligence to the Allies. When the Japanese surrendered, only 5% of the Huks laid down their arms. The rest either kept fighting or went underground to wait for another chance to fight. The U.S. needed to know who the guerrillas were so they could turn them into allies. And fortunately, the U.S. broke their promise to pardon guerrillas who had committed atrocities. That meant that Filipinos who fought against the Japanese could be arrested and executed by the very people they helped defeat. But that's not all Filipino veterans are remembered for. They're also remembered for the injustice they faced when the war was over. After the war ended, many Filipino veterans returned home, expecting to receive the benefits and compensation that had been promised to them. Instead, they were told that they weren't eligible for U.S. military benefits. Why? Well, it had to do with the way the Philippines gained independence. In 1946, the U.S. passed the Philippine Independence Act, which granted the Philippines full independence, but it also included something called the Rescission Act. It said that the U.S. wouldn't pay for veterans' benefits for Filipino veterans. And the reason given was that they were, quote, not entitled to the privileges and benefits of the U.S. laws. Basically, they were considered to be foreign nationals. And so the U.S. had no obligation to take care of them. On top of that, the U.S. didn't want to set a bad example for other colonies. If the Filipinos got benefits, then people in other U.S. territories might demand the same thing. And don't forget, during the war, Filipino veterans were paid less and had fewer rights than white American soldiers. So when it came time for them to get benefits, well, they were told they were only getting what was left over after all the white guys were taken care of. For decades, Filipino veterans and their families struggled to get the benefits and compensation they deserved. Even after President John F. Kennedy apologized to the Filipino veterans in 1963, nothing changed. But in the 1990s, things started to change. A group of Filipino American veterans and activists started a campaign to raise awareness and lobby Congress. Finally, in 1990, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs created a special office to help Filipino veterans apply for benefits. Then in 1991, the Veterans Benefits Act of 1991 was signed into law. It gave Filipino veterans and their families access to health care, pension benefits, and other forms of compensation. It was a big step forward, but it didn't go far enough. Many Filipino veterans were still denied benefits because they couldn't prove they were in the military. And there were hundreds of thousands of veteran records from the Philippines that were lost or destroyed during the war. So many veterans simply couldn't get the documentation they needed to qualify for benefits. In 2009, the situation finally started to turn around. An act of Congress ordered that all veterans who served in the Philippine Scouts be automatically granted veteran status. In 2016, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs officially apologized to Filipino veterans for denying them benefits. And today, Filipino veterans and their families continue to fight for recognition and compensation. In 2021, the Secretary of Veterans Affairs announced that the department would review the cases of Filipino veterans who were denied benefits. It's a small step, but hopefully it will lead to more recognition and respect for these brave soldiers. I think stories like this are important to remember for a couple of reasons. First, it reminds us that war is hell. Not just for the people who fight it, but also for the people who support the war effort. Second, it as a reminder that sometimes the people we fight alongside aren't the same people as our enemies. And that's true in World War II and it's true today. Just look at the Russian-Ukrainian war. Right now, Chechens from the Russian Republic of Chechnya are fighting alongside Russian soldiers against Ukraine. But 20 years ago, Chechen soldiers fought alongside U.S. troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. Third, this story is a reminder that sometimes the people who seem like allies aren't really allies at all. After the war, the U.S. didn't want to set a bad example. So they denied Filipino veterans benefits. And that goes back to the Philippine Revolution when the U.S. promised the Philippines independence but then didn't follow through. But maybe the biggest lesson from this story is that good people can come from everywhere and fighting for your country doesn't always mean you're a bad person. Filipino veterans fought for the United States not because they loved America or the American government, but because they wanted to defend the Philippines. If you'd like to learn more about Filipino veterans, I put some resources in the description, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing. The Filipinos have long been known as a brave and resilient people. During the Second World War, they proved it once again when they fought against the Japanese invaders. What many may not know is that these courageous fighters didn't face the enemy alone. They had allies, the Americans who fought shoulder to shoulder with them and formed one of the most unlikely partnerships of the war. This is their story. When the Japanese attacked the Philippines in December 1941, the islands were caught off guard. The defenders, a mix of Filipino and American soldiers, put up a valiant fight, but they were ultimately overwhelmed. Bataan fell after 4 months of fighting and Corregidor soon followed. Many Americans and Filipinos were captured and forced into infamous prison camps like Bataan's infamous prison camp. However, most Filipinos refused to submit. Instead, they joined various resistance groups, which would come to be known as guerrillas, striking back at the occupier whenever they could. These guerrillas provided the first line of defense for the islands. And among them was a man named Paquito, whose story is our entry point into this collaboration. After escaping execution by the Japanese, Paquito and his fellow guerrillas began ambushing Japanese patrols and gathering intelligence. They observed Japanese troop movements, supply routes and defensive positions, becoming a thorn in the side of the occupiers. As fate would have it, Paco's brother was an American pilot shot down over the islands. His time with the guerrillas gave Paco insight into the tactics and needs of these resistance fighters. He saw firsthand their bravery, resourcefulness, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. When American forces started planning their return to the Philippines, they knew they needed this intelligence and the help of those who possessed it. In 1944, MacArthur's forces began a series of offensives to liberate the islands. But the liberation was far from easy. It required detailed plans, coordinated logistics, and a deep understanding of the enemy. That's where the guerrillas came in. At the start of the campaign to retake the Philippines, Filipino guerrillas played a vital role in the recapture of Leyte in October 1944. Despite being vastly outnumbered and outgunned, these brave fighters launched surprise attacks, ambushed Japanese supply lines, and provided cover for Allied troops. Their actions not only helped to secure Leyte, but also demonstrated the tenacity and courage of the Filipino people. Their participation in this campaign was a testament to their unwavering spirit of resistance against the Japanese occupation. But their contribution went beyond just the battlefield. You see, intelligence is often called the lifeblood of any military campaign, and Filipino guerrillas were its key suppliers. They provided the Americans with invaluable information about Japanese troop deployments, defensive strategies, and logistical networks. This intelligence was often gathered at great personal risk. Guerrillas relayed information through a combination of secret codes, hidden messages, and clandestine meetings. Despite the danger, they were committed to supporting the liberation effort and providing the Americans with the knowledge they needed to succeed. As the campaign progressed and American forces grew in numbers, the guerrillas became more active in combat operations. They engaged in direct confrontations with the Japanese, sabotaging their efforts and inflicting casualties. These engagements ranged from small-scale ambushes to full-blown battles. The guerrillas' intimate knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable here, enabling them to set traps and launch surprise attacks that caught the Japanese off guard. The collaboration between the guerrillas and the Americans intensified during the Battle of Manila in February 1945. The Filipinos knew the city's winding streets and hidden passages like the back of their hands. They guided the Americans through these urban labyrinths, allowing them to navigate the complex environment with greater ease. The guerrillas' presence was crucial in helping the Americans to liberate Manila from the clutches of the Japanese. However, not all their efforts were on the battlefield. The guerrillas also played a vital role in rescue and raid operations. Perhaps the most daring of these was the raid at Los Baños in February 1945. This operation involved a joint effort by Filipino guerrillas and American commandos to free prisoners of war and internees from a Japanese prison camp. The raid was fraught with danger, but it was a resounding success, with hundreds of Allied soldiers and civilians liberated thanks to the guerrillas' help. Similarly, the Cabanatuan raid carried out in January 1945 was another testament to their bravery and resourcefulness. Filipino guerrillas, with support from American Special Forces, rescued more than 500 Allied prisoners of war from a Japanese prison camp. Such raids not only showcased the guerrillas' commitment to the liberation cause, but also underscored the strong bond that had developed between them and their American allies. The alliance between the Filipinos and Americans wasn't one-sided. The Americans understood the importance of supporting the guerrillas in their struggle for independence. They provided the guerrillas with much-needed supplies, including weapons, ammunition, and equipment. These supplies were often dropped from aircraft or delivered by submarines in covert operations. The Americans also provided training and leadership to the guerrillas, helping them to improve their combat skills and overall effectiveness. For instance, Filipino Americans from the 1st and 2nd Filipino Infantry Regiments in California were sent to the Philippines for reconnaissance and supplying the guerrillas with much-needed resources. Moreover, the Americans recognized the value of Filipino culture and traditions. They made efforts to understand and respect local customs, building trust and camaraderie with the guerrillas. This mutual respect laid the foundation for a strong and lasting partnership that played a pivotal role in the liberation of the Philippines. As the war in the Pacific reached its final stages, the collaboration between Filipino guerrillas and Americans culminated in the liberation of Manila in February 1945. This operation was the culmination of years of resistance and sacrifice by the Filipino people. The guerrillas' intimate knowledge of the city and their willingness to fight alongside the Americans were instrumental in the successful liberation of Manila from Japanese forces. However, the impact of this collaboration extended beyond the battlefield. It played a significant role in shaping the relationship between the Philippines and the United States. The shared experiences of fighting side by side forged a strong bond between the two nations, laying the groundwork for enduring partnership in the post-war era. As the war drew to a close, the Filipino guerrillas continued to play an essential role in the Pacific theater. Their contributions extended to other fronts, assisting Allied forces in their campaigns against the Japanese. For instance, guerrillas in Borneo provided crucial support to the Australians in their fight against the Japanese. Their knowledge of the terrain and their commitment to the Allied cause helped to turn the tide against the enemy. Even in areas like Singapore, Filipino guerrillas were instrumental in gathering intelligence and providing logistical support to the British and Indian forces in their efforts to recapture the city fr. On the Japanese. This widespread involvement of Filipino guerrillas across the Pacific theater highlights their significant and often underappreciated contributions to the Allied war effort. However, the Filipino guerrillas' impact went beyond their military contributions. Their resilience and bravery in the face of Japanese occupation inspired people around the world. They became symbols of resistance and hope, showing that even in the darkest of times, the spirit of freedom cannot be subdued. Theirs was a fight for independence, for freedom and for the soul of their nation. The Filipino guerrillas' use of unconventional warfare tactics was a testament to their resourcefulness and adaptability. Guerrilla warfare involves hit-and-run tactics, ambushes and sabotage, which require a deep understanding of the local terrain and the enemy's vulnerabilities. Filipino guerrillas excelled in these areas, employing strategies that were both effective and innovative. For example, they utilized knowledge of dense jungles and mountainous regions to launch surprise attacks on Japanese forces and then quickly retreat to well-concealed positions, making it difficult for the Japanese to retaliate. They also used psychological tactics to demoralize their enemies, spreading rumors and misinformation to confuse the Japanese and instilling fear to undermine their resolve. These unconventional methods proved highly effective, not only in inflicting casualties on the Japanese, but also in tying down significant numbers of enemy troops, forcing them to divert resources away from other areas. In essence, Filipino guerrillas demonstrated that even with limited resources, a determined and well-led resistance can inflict heavy costs on a powerful occupying force. In conclusion, the Filipino guerrillas' use of unconventional warfare tactics was a critical factor in their success during the Second World War. Their resourcefulness and adaptability in employing guerrilla strategies not only contributed significantly to the liberation of the Philippines, but also left a lasting legacy on military thinking. And it's important to remember that while we can talk about the military aspects, the Filipino guerrillas' contribution goes beyond that. Their story is one of courage, resilience and an unyielding spirit of independence. Their fight was not just against a foreign invader, but also for the soul of their nation. Theirs is a legacy that continues to inspire generations, reminding us that in the face of tyranny, courage and determination can prevail. Today, as we look back at their extraordinary contributions, let us be inspired by their bravery, and let their story serve as a beacon of hope and a testament to the indomitable spirit of the Filipino people. If you want to learn more about the unsung heroes of the Philippines during World War II, check out this video next. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to stay updated on our latest releases. Thank you for watching. Stay safe and we'll see you in the next one.